I vetoed the council's action involving rideshare. And also a few moments ago, the state report came out involving 18 million rides, providing very important data that would have been extremely relevant to the conversation the council has been having. I've been telling the council for 6 months now to wait for the information to come out. I wrote them an email 3 weeks ago requesting that they wait for the report so that they could use this important information in ultimately crafting policy. They didn't want to wait. They didn't want to wait a single day or move back the decision just one cycle. And what is clear based on this report, and we're still digging in, is that the council's policy is not based in reality. So I vetoed the council action. There is a route to make sure that drivers get paid more, that the rate of pay increases, and we keep this very important service in our city. We can have both of these things at the same time, but it requires us to operate in reality. It requires us to engage with all of the partners that are involved. That didn't happen. Anything that passes through my desk, we're going to make sure that it's done right. So far, that hasn't been the case. I'm just having an opportunity to review most of this report myself, and so I'm not going to weigh in too much on individual statistics yet, because I want to make sure that I do my due diligence before making a position. As you all have experienced, this can get pretty nuanced. What is clear is that the council's policy, though, is off. I will be calling a special session, likely for this next week. The reason for calling the special session is that, as of right now, we don't have the votes to sustain a veto based on the vote count from yesterday. If, in fact, the council's going to override my veto, we want to give people and businesses as much time to prepare, given that Uber and Lyft would likely leave. If they are to override my veto, we want to make sure that all of the people that are of lower incomes and don't have a car, that disabled people and individuals that are planning a trip to Minneapolis have as much time to prepare as possible, if in case that service is not available to them. This is serious business. This impacts a whole lot of people. And when you've got a policy you're moving forward that has such a tremendous impact on the entire region, you gotta do your due diligence first. I'm very appreciative of the Department of Labor and the state of Minnesota. I'm thankful for the governor's work as well to come forward with a study that is so comprehensive. We're talking about 18 million rides that were evaluated here. We're talking about deep analysis that went to the heart both of how much drivers are making on an hourly basis and also what their costs are. This is going to be worth digging into, and we're certainly going to do that ourselves. With that, I'll open it to questions you might have.
Was there a reason for pushing this back from April to May, and did that have anything to do with more time just to discuss this with this council and or prepare for the absence of Uber and Lyft in town?
So that particular amendment was made by the council, and so I certainly don't want to speak for them. But if you're going to vote to move the effective date back, why not slightly delay the period before you make a decision, because you're not going to have to implement it anyway? Does that make sense? In other words, if you have more time before the date becomes effective and you know that the report is going to come out the very next day, why not wait a brief period of time so that you know that the data that you've got and the assumptions that you're making are actually correct? We've got the data now. We can do the deep dive. We can do the important work of policy and good governance, and no, sadly that wasn't done before.
If this is all heading in the direction that it appears to be heading, are there any plans, or is there any discussion as far as maybe a city-led rideshare service or something to kind of fill that gap if Uber and Lyft do leave?
We're not there yet, and the amount of time that would take to get set up in any serious way would be far more significant than the number of weeks we're talking about. That's also operating in reality.
Do you have any doubt that the companies will leave if your veto gets overridden?
I can't predict the future, but they've been very clear. I've made clear to them that we can't be operating in bluffs here. We need full honesty and transparency about where things are going. And I believe and will strongly support drivers getting paid more. I've said that since the very beginning. We need to make sure that drivers are paid more in our city, and we can do that in a way where we're bringing parties to the tables so that the service is not dropped entirely. So, no, I can't predict the future. What's also made clear about in this report is that the statements that council has made with regard to meeting the minimum wage or failing to meet the minimum wage were also incorrect.
Can you talk about Uber's response and how that plays into this, their proposal for a $36 an hour wage for drivers, and they're waiting on the state's legislation, and kind of how Minneapolis will deal with that moving forward?
I've heard about the $36 an hour proposal. Haven't had a lot of chance to dig into it yet. So certainly that's something that we'll look at.
This report, the one piece of information the commissioner could not get to, the deal I can get to, is profit margins. That they couldn't get the information they needed for that. I mean, are you satisfied that these T&Cs aren't just gouging the drivers, aren't basically stealing from drivers, like not giving them enough money?
I have not had enough time to fully analyze the report to make that determination. There's a number of proposals from around the country that have some merit. There's the policy that Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, has advocated for and I believe passed. That's one option, and it's a pretty significant different analysis than the one that's made through just increasing rates of pay both on a per mile and a per minute basis. There's the $36 an hour proposal that you had just mentioned. I mean, what's clear is that we're not operating in the range of minimum wage. We're talking about significantly more than that. And still, these drivers are working hard. We need to make sure that we're supporting them. And so again, I'm gonna strongly support an ordinance that gets these drivers paid more while keeping this important service in the city. It doesn't do any good to get an increase in pay if your job doesn't exist.
What's your big takeaway from the report? That you say you haven't had a chance to go into it too deep, but what's your big takeaway?
My big takeaway is that there is a route. This is something that I believed, perhaps assumed earlier, but this provides real-time data to back that up. There is a route, but that successful route where we both raise the pay and keep the service in our city is not achieved by blindly marching forward. You got to engage with people. You got to engage on all sides, even those that you don't necessarily agree with. And that's a broader issue that I have with politics right now, is that people will simply talk to their own side, create unilateral, one-sided policy. That's just not good governance.
I don't know if you want to get into any detail at all, but it looks like $1.21 per hour.
It's $1.20
per mile, $20.7.
There you go. Yeah, fair. Round up.
Would get you to minimum wage and 48.7 cents per minute in the metro would get you to the Minneapolis minimum wage equivalent. That's a little higher than what you had been counter proposing. Are you willing to go up to that?
I'm willing to follow what the study says, period. What I had been, my primary proposal was wait for the information to come out. Assuming the council wasn't willing to do that, which they weren't, we had a proposal that was brought forward based on a negotiated rate. Now, importantly, and this is where what I propose is actually not significantly different at all, the proposal you just mentioned includes all forms of benefit. So that's not just the minimum wage, that's the wear and tear on the vehicle, that's gas, that's cell phone, that's vehicle cleaning, and a host of other issues as well that is also accounted for in that number. I wasn't necessarily accounting for any of that, and so if you do account for it, of course the dollar figure goes up. And again, this is why you wait for the report to come out. This is why you use data and analysis that doesn't have an assumed conclusion from the very beginning.
When would the special meeting of the council be?
Likely Thursday.
Is there any word on how fast things can work on state legislation? As you know, Uber said, if this is the law that stands on May 1st, they will leave the city. Do you think that a broader law for the state will come about before that time, or how is that looking?
I don't know. I can't speak for the state legislature. Obviously, they have been working diligently on some form of proposal. I am willing to sign into law a city proposal that is backed by the state data that just came out. That's the right way of going. We've got, while we don't have, and again, with the caveat of I haven't read the whole thing yet, there is, well, I did not see a Minneapolis-specific dollar figure. There is a metro-wide one. One can assume that you'd make more in Minneapolis than you did in the rest of the metro, just given the proximity of rides and the shift in how pricing functions.
Have you weighed in yet on, this report looked at time they're on the phone waiting to get a call, time driving to that passenger, and then time driving with the passenger. Have you thought through any of the options you think they should be paid for all of the time or part of the time?
I have. So there's 3 different time periods. There's the time period just while the application is turned on. There's the time period while the driver is driving to pick up the customer. And then there's the period where the customer is in the car. Those are, broadly speaking, the 3 ranges. I think the primary 2 that we've got to be looking at are 2 and 3, the second and third areas. It doesn't make sense to have the rate be based on the first, because then all of us would move to a rural area, turn on our application, and sit in front of the TV because no ride is ever going to contact you. I mean, the whole thing breaks down if you use the first option in that way. Maybe there's some proposal out there that I'm not aware of, and I'm certainly open to it, but based on the reasoning that I've seen, it's really numbers 2 and 3 that make the most sense.
Yeah, and I was a little bit confused about this morning, and my coverage wasn't, I don't think, very clear on this, but I actually think, was your counter proposal and the council's proposal, were they pretty much all on P3?
2 and 3.
It was 2 and 3? Okay.
I don't know about the councils. I was speaking about 2 and 3.
Okay, okay.
If you had to give a thumbnail description of what this special session will be about, is it just a chance for you to address the council before they reach the override point, or bring in more testimony or more witnesses? What would that special session be about?
After a veto is issued, the council has an opportunity to override that veto. Normally, the override would take place at the next official council meeting, which would be a week or 2 further off. And so the purpose of doing this is, I mean, there's no games here. The purpose of doing this is to say, if you are overriding my veto, let's do it earlier so that we've got time to prepare for what could be the inevitable. If you don't override the veto, let's get to work on passing a policy here in Minneapolis that is actually based on the data. This is a pretty simple proposition here. As I stated numerous times, both verbally and in writing, it makes sense to wait until we know what we're talking about. Seems like a simple thing to say, but not everybody's getting it. It makes sense to wait until we know what we're talking about. We now have a better idea of what we're talking about based on an analysis with 18 million rides included. Let's use it. Let's craft good policy. This is what we should be doing. This is what we should be doing at the city. Crafting good policy, and of course there are arguments that'll take place. Of course there are differences in philosophy, but we at the very least have to be operating based on a common set of facts. And I've seen facts twisted over the last several months in more issues than just rideshare. We've got to be operating in reality, and in this case, they weren't. Let's do this right this time. Let's do this right. So I'm calling on all my colleagues. I'm calling on everybody to let's craft thoughtful legislation based on facts, and we're going to be able to accomplish all the goals here. We're going to be able to increase the pay for drivers. We're going to be able to keep rideshare in our city. And as I've said before, there are so many people that do, in fact, use it and benefit from it in some way.
You have a chance to lobby council members quietly, one-on-one. You need one less vote, and then the veto stands. Do you have any optimism that you'll be able to?
I do.
Vote?
Yeah, I do have some optimism that they won't override my veto, not just based on conversations that I've had, but also based on the reality that just hit today. The reality of the data just hit today. Let's listen to it. My hope is that council members will not put blinders on, but take them off. Look at what the data says, and let's make good, informed policy decisions based on it. Now, I made a prediction a few days ago where I said they're going to come forward with the exact same rate of pay that they did 6 months ago. I was right. They were going to pass that rate. That happened. I was going to veto it. I did veto it. Now, the next phase of this prediction is that they're not going to be able to override my veto, and my concern is that they'll then want to do nothing. I hope I'm wrong.
So you are predicting that they're not going to be able to override. That's how optimistic you are.
If I had to guess right now, I would say they're not going to be able to override. I've been wrong. I've been wrong before. I could be wrong again on this. But my hope again, if they don't override, we don't need to. We can actually take a next step here. It's not like the story is over. We can then pass a policy that is based on the data and that I will sign. And we've been in this place before where it goes back and forth. There's areas of agreement, and then they take it further, and suddenly the agreement is cut off. We were there with. I wanted a ceasefire, for instance. Wanted to see a ceasefire, was willing to sign on to a ceasefire. We had some uniting language that I was certainly willing to unite around. They wanted to take it further. There is an area based on the data where the people that we all want to help, that we all claim to want to help, will in fact receive the assistance they need, and we can keep the operation going. Any other questions?
The report, I think, kind of acknowledged that if these rates are raised, that what the passengers pay will raise,
Yeah.
will go up. So
It's another reality that we got to consider. We have to consider what drivers are making, and again, I believe that they should get paid more. We also have to be looking at the underlying cost to the rider as well. From what I have seen is that the average rider in Minneapolis is significantly lower income than the average rider in other cities. And so we are at times talking about people that don't own a car and are trying to find a cheap way from getting from point A to point B when public transportation isn't fully available. We are talking about people with disabilities. Of course we're talking about people that need to get home from the bar. And look, Minneapolis is a world-class city, and part of being a world-class city is that you got a range of transportation options when a tourist from out of town shows up at the airport. When I show up at the airport in another city, sometimes I do use public transportation. Sometimes I get picked up by a friend. And yeah, sometimes I hit up Uber or Lyft and I get a ride where I need to go. I'm sure many of us have used one of those three options. We need to make sure that we've got options here in our city as well. All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was gonna say that the mayor of Council Bluffs, Iowa, can't operate.
Thanks, John. Talk to you later.
Say it again.
You said earlier we can't operate in Bluffs, and I said, well, the